the Chase Thomas Podcast, for people who have nothing but time to kill.
Your team played first. My dad and I actually sat outside the student union and watched the whole second half of Georgia Auburn before we went into to the Coliseum to see the Vols and Gamecocks do battle under the lights on Saturday. But it was a tale of two halves, which we're now seeing a lot for the Georgia Bulldogs. I think is my biggest takeaway is just you got to wait till the second half, whether it's Auburn, South Carolina. It's just going to be really, really hard to beat the Dogs over 4 full quarters unless, as the broadcast points out, every time the Dogs are in a dogfight, pardon the pun, is like the only people to beat Kirby really are the Heisman-type quarterbacks, the C.J. Strouds, the Bryce Youngs. You got to have that kind of quarterback to sustain offensive excellence over 4 quarters, and Peyton Thorne had that 61-yard touchdown run, that or 61-yard play, and Auburn was able to run the ball pretty well in the first half and do some stuff, but it wasn't 4 quarters worth. It was the second half struggled. A lot of Robbie Ashford as the game went on, which we saw how that went a year ago. Just kind of very one-dimensional that I just don't think you can beat this iteration of Kirby's Bulldogs with, is just that kind of one-dimensional run-first type of offense. I think you keep running into a wall in that way, and just makes it that much harder. That was my strong takeaway from what I saw against Georgia and Auburn. But this is your team. You've got a better field, Matt Green. What did you see against the Auburn Tigers?
I would agree with you. And they showed the last 4 quarterbacks to beat Georgia dated back to 2020. And it was Mac Jones, going all the way back to Joe Burrow, Kyle Trask, Bryce Young. Not only were all those guys Heisman finalists, or a couple won the Heisman, but all of them had 400 yards and 4 touchdowns in those games too. And yeah, not even including CJ Stroud, who had a similar performance. Peyton Thorne didn't do anything in the passing game. So the fact that they were just running the ball with no real threat of the pass game, it's that was probably what worried you the most. I don't know how many other teams on Georgia's schedule kind of run this type of offense. Maybe they'll do something like it if it gives Georgia so many problems. But I feel like it seemed like at one point Auburn made the decision, and we were kind of sitting at home if they're not going to pass, Robbie Ashford is way better for this system, and he was in for a drive or so. But I guess Peyton Thorne gives you the threat of the pass, but they didn't really do anything in the passing game. So for them to just continue to have these little runs and get to the outside, or Thorne just scramble, I've never seen Peyton Thorne. I haven't watched all of Peyton Thorne's games, right? But I've never seen Peyton Thorne have that sort of rushing production. So I think that was definitely frustrating as a Georgia fan. But I think when we talk about Georgia, it's we do have to acknowledge that we're just talking about them at a different standard, right? It's but if we go back to 2021, I remember a certain quarterback whose Heisman moment was beating a 6-6 Auburn team in Jordan-Hare Stadium. And that was a game that what they score 14 points in regulation, and Bryce Young, is a gutty win and all that. Obviously I'm not comparing Carson Beck to Bryce Young, but this is Carson Beck's first road start of his career. We all know about Jordan-Hare Stadium. And also when you get somebody, I think is very important too. This early in the season, everyone's still got their hopes and dreams of what their season could be. And the crowd is pumped. The players are pumped. Auburn could win the SEC West at this point, right? Going into this Georgia game with 1 loss on the season. So Jordan-Hare Stadium is one of the loudest environments in college football. And I think for Georgia to go on the road, it wasn't pretty by any means. And if you're talking about where we rank Georgia as among the best teams in college football, then yeah, there's some concerns. But I think this was one of the 2 biggest tests, I think, when we looked at Georgia's schedule preseason. It's Hugh Freeze. It's all at Auburn on the road. Being Carson Beck's first road start, this was a tricky positioned game when you've played a bunch of cupcakes. This is the first real opponent. No disrespect to South Carolina. Obviously it's a good, a legitimate opponent, but it was at home. This is definitely the first real challenge. And you saw Georgia was, got off to another slow start, but they were still able to get it done on the road. I think you still have to call it a good win, right?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. It seems like a lot of the takeaways from Georgia folks and analysts and what have you looked at this as like a championship just flex from Georgia, that this was a huge win for them, that a lot of teams probably would have gone down playing the way they did for 3 quarters, but that this says a lot about Georgia's resolve and the makeup of this team and why fans should still not panic about just kind of being in some close counters with South Carolina and Auburn. Do you share that sentiment, or do you think it's a little overblown that Georgia was able to kind of withstand some heavy blows from Auburn in the first half and just be able to get on the other side of that and lock things down, find Brock Bowers over and over again, the defense tightening up? Was that your takeaway, or did you come away, it's good to get away from a win, an SEC win is an SEC win, but let's not overthink Georgia in this regard and give them too much credit for surviving against an Auburn team that still might go 7-5, 6-6, depending on how the rest of the season goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff can kind of be overblown, and if Georgia does win the national championship, like, yeah, in retrospect, you can go back and be like, that was a character building win, or championship teams win those games or something. Like, yeah, maybe there's an element to that when you're Georgia now, you're number one team in the country every week. It's the biggest game of the season for anyone that's hosting the number one team in the country, right? So you're going to get everybody's best shot. Auburn's obviously a huge rivalry to begin with. So like these teams have a lot of familiarity. Hugh Freeze is a really good offensive mind. Like we just know that, he's going to have some wrinkles that teams aren't ready for. But I mean, I think the way the game played out, I think it feels like it was like correctable things like that Kent State game a year ago, not comparing Auburn to Kent State, but they had just a couple of just uncharacteristic things happen, like losing outside containment and guys just breaking long runs. Like, I feel like that's what you saw a lot in the first half, Georgia not being able to set the edge. And so it felt like in the second half, like Javon Bullard, I think in the running game, like I feel like he made a huge difference just coming up from the safety position. Like that dude just has a nose for the ball. But I mean, this team it's not 2021 or 2022. Like Trayvon Walker and Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter and Devontae Wyatt aren't on this team. So I think Georgia's still really good, but I think there is, a level that maybe they're not quite as elite as we thought going into the season, but that doesn't mean they're not still the number one team in the country. It's like we've seen Florida State beat Boston College by 2 on the road. Like the Clemson game. Like, I mean, if Clemson had a competent kicker, Clemson beats Florida State last week. So it's I think if you're talking about just pressing the panic button, it's too early. Like as a Georgia fan, if that's not a good Auburn team, then obviously you want to beat them by more than 1 touchdown. But I think my biggest takeaway, to be honest, was that Georgia's definitely got a quarterback. Like I think Carson Beck proved on Saturday, like, because that interception, I don't really put that on Beck. Like that's just a great defensive play. Like the way he just came over the top of the receiver. Also, like Auburn's 2 touchdown drives in this game were both off of turnovers with a short field. So as much as they were giving up in the running game, and it was the first 200-yard rushing game Georgia's allowed since 2018 at LSU. So they were able to overcome some adversity and win a game like this. I think it does say a lot, and mainly because this is what we talked about with Georgia. Like they might not be as good as last year, but their schedule, who's going to expose it? Like that's what it comes down to. It's a favorable schedule. But when I saw Carson Beck on Saturday, I felt like that, like 15 to 25 yard, like those intermediate throws, I think he is so much better than Stetson Bennett. I think that's where you can see like the difference in like the arm talent between Carson Beck and Stetson Bennett. Like he's missed a couple deep shots. Like he missed one last week against what was that? Was that UAB or South Carolina? He missed a wide open guy, but missing an Oscar Delp, like could have been like a 60-yard touchdown early in this game. But I think Carson Beck really, to me, showed that like, as far as the contenders go, like I'll put Caleb Williams and Quinn Ewers above Carson Beck, but I don't think anyone else has a distinguishable advantage at quarterback over what Georgia's got with Carson Beck. And at the end of the day, they have Brock Bowers, and he might be the best player in college football. Like, this guy just snagging shit with one hand. Like, they were absolutely feeding this man. And it may have taken a little bit long for them to start feeding him, but I think when you have that guy, and I think with Georgia's weapons, the offensive line is probably the biggest concern from the first 5 weeks, is that they're just not necessarily dominating teams on the ground like you kind of expected them to. And they have the Amarius Mims injury that's definitely a factor in that. But I think even before that, it's not necessarily the dominant O-line play you thought you were going to get. But I think, if these few running backs can stay healthy, and I'm honestly, I think it's at this point, it's Dejon Edwards and Dylan Bell really are like the only two running backs that really look like they give you anything right now. Like, I don't know if Kendall Milton is still not healthy or what, but at this point, you just can't really count on him being healthy. So as long as they don't get, an injury to the running back, because that position is lacking a lot of depth, I think Georgia still has enough firepower to beat every team that's left on their schedule.
We should also, if we're going to talk Georgia Auburn, the fact that we haven't mentioned Brock Bowers and the one-handed catches that he pulled off in this game, just really putting the team on his back. That helps a young quarterback or a quarterback on the road. Is like, don't overthink some of this stuff, where it's like, hey, this is your first road test, raucous environment at Jordan-Hare. Just go find Brock Bowers. Find 19, put it within reach. And I mean, he had some weird drops too. When Georgia was driving near the goal line, where it's like, oh, Brock usually catches those, where they had to settle for a field goal. I forgot what drive it was.
He is one of those. It's like I don't know, like an Andrew Jones error or something. Mm-hmm. You're like, I mean, that wasn't an error, but he just makes all the great plays I just expect him to make. But yeah, there was the one right there at the goal line. I think if you're talking about that, like that, I think the defensive back actually knocked it down. But the play right before that, it was like a back shoulder throw, right? Yeah, it's like, it would have been a great catch, but it's like Bowers like typically catches everything thrown to him.
And he was great. Edwards was great. But on the defensive side of things, have you seen enough where you think teams are going to be able to run the football? Good teams are going to be able to run the football on this Georgia run. You mentioned Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, and some of those guys are just not on this defense anymore. I think Chaz Chambliss had a really good game from what I saw too in this one. But Malachi Stark's obviously all over the place. To you, is there more opportunity for Tennessee, who has a three-headed monster at running back? And just a heads up, they're going to try to run on Georgia. Like, that is what they want to do. They ran all over. They're taking the ball out of Joe Milton's hands, and they are just going to bet on running it down your throat and creating havoc with Dylan Sampson and Jalen Wright. But this won't be the last team to try and do this. I mean, Missouri, Brady Cook's cooking a little bit. Ray Davis, obviously, we'll get to in his big day for Kentucky. With some big backs and teams that really want to run the football, did you see enough that Auburn kind of worries you about what teams are going to be able to do on the ground against Georgia that they have not been able to do in the last couple of years?
I mean, I think it's definitely a concern because teams just never run on Georgia. So the fact that a team that really had no threat of the pass was able to run on Georgia, I mean, I think that's what you have to be concerned about. But I also think there's something about Auburn's running game that is also just kind of a different look that I'm not sure like someone like Kentucky can replicate, And also, I really do think the home field aspect of it too is just, it's a game changer. Like you saw what Florida was when Tennessee was at home, like in that big game, in their atmosphere, like that, they almost ran the ball at will. Like on the road, the other two games they've had, big games they've had on the road, they're a completely different team. So I think when teams just get that home crowd behind them, it's like you're able to get to a level that you're not normally at. And so I think, I don't know, I don't want to make the whole excuse, like I'm making excuses for Georgia because of Jordan-Hare Stadium, like it's some sort of superpower, but I think Jordan-Hare Stadium is like just a tough place to play. So you got to be concerned with how they were doing it, because Joe Milton, he might not be as advertised so far through this season, but he's a hell of a lot better than Peyton Thorne is. So there's other teams that do want to run the ball that might actually have a competent passing game. And that might be something that Georgia has to worry about. But I do think the secondary is probably the strong point of this defense so far through this season. But I think Jamon Dumas-Johnson is a guy who's gotten a lot of criticism so far. Just, I don't know, looks a step slow or something, because he's had a couple rough games, and I think that's kind of where some of Georgia's problems lie. It's just they're not tackling just